In just 6 hours, over 1,000 armed insurgents were erased from the face of Africa. Not by foreign troops, not by superpowers, not even by machines alone, but by a young captain the world once mocked, Ibrahim Traoré. They came with rifles and confidence, believing they'd pass through like always. But this time, the sky was watching. This time, the land was ready. And this time, Burkina Faso didn't wait for permission. Led by villagers with no uniforms, drones no bigger than birds, and a vision born from centuries of silence. The ambush that followed didn't just rewrite strategy, it rewrote dignity. How did a forgotten nation, once colonized, dismissed, and left to burn, turn its people into censors, its engineers into warriors, and its deserts into weapons of justice? Tonight we take you inside a moment the world barely noticed, but that history will never forget. This is a dramatized retelling based on real-world tensions, events, and possibilities. Some characters and details are fictional, but the emotions, the legacy, and the questions we raise are absolutely real. Arbinda Corridor, 2:13 a.m. The night was thick, not just with heat, but with something heavier. Dust curled like smoke in the air, stirred by the steady groan of engines grinding across sand and broken road. A convoy nearly a kilometer long pushed through the Arbinda Corridor, 32 vehicles in all, modified pickups, transport trucks, motorbikes with double riders, even one flatbed with a mounted anti-aircraft gun, its barrel wobbling lazily like it was bored with the idea of war. Above them, the sky stretched blank and starless, moonlight smothered by Saharan haze. No drones in sight, no gunfire in the distance, just the crunch of wheels, the grumble of diesel, and the sound of men who thought they owned the night. They laughed, loud, careless. One shouted something obscene, and the others howled in response, pounding on the sides of their vehicles like drums. Someone lit a cigarette. Someone else shot it out of his mouth just for sport. They weren't in a hurry. They weren't afraid. Because for the past 6 months they had moved like ghosts, raiding, burning, disappearing into the brush without consequence. No one had touched them. Not the army, not the UN, not even the Americans who flew overhead with satellites and smiles. So tonight, this was just routine. Another mission, another village to silence. But they didn't know what waited beneath the sand, or behind the trees, and they definitely didn't see the girl. On the edge of the corridor, hidden in the tall grass, a pair of wide, unblinking eyes tracked the lights. 1, 2, 3. She counted in whispers, barely moving her lips. 9 years old, barefoot. Her name was Mariama, though no one had called her that since her mother was taken. They called her Little Bird now, because she never made a sound, but always knew when the storm was coming. Tonight she'd been waiting since sundown. She hadn't moved, hadn't blinked much. She didn't dare. She held a stick in her hand, pressed into the dirt. Every 5th truck she scratched a mark. Every 10th she made it deeper. Her eyes moved fast, but her body stayed still. Perfectly still, like something carved from the land itself. At the 20th vehicle, she turned ever so slightly, just enough for the moon to catch the faint silver glint of something beneath her scarf. A small transmitter, no bigger than a thumb. She pressed it, just once. No sound, no signal seen. But somewhere, many miles away, someone's screen blinked to life. Back in the convoy, the leader rode near the center, a man with a scar from ear to jaw, wearing Western sunglasses even at night. They called him Bashir, but most didn't use his name. He liked that. It meant fear. He stood in the truck bed, rifle slung across his chest, eyes scanning the road ahead like a bored predator. He yawned, lit another cigarette, and then he laughed. "They say Burkina Faso has a new boy king," he muttered in Arabic. "Let him come. We'll burn his little throne, too." His men cheered, the kind of laughter that comes before terrible things. But he didn't notice that the sky had changed. He didn't see the tiny dark dot circling high above, almost lost against the stars. It wasn't a bird, it wasn't a plane, and it wasn't watching the convoy, it was watching Mariama. because she was the trigger. The convoy was just bait. And in this war, the first shot wasn't fired from a rifle. It was a whisper carried by a child, and the war to come had already begun. High above the convoy, higher than the dust clouds, higher than the tallest tree in the Sahel, something hovered, silent, unseen. It was no larger than a hawk, with wings that didn't flap and a body that didn't breathe, but it saw everything. Thermal heat, movement trails, vehicle count. Even the cigarette in Bashir's mouth glowed like a red pixel against the black canvas of the earth below. This was Drone Phi 17, a handmade recon unit designed just 6 months ago in a basement beneath Ouagadougou. No foreign parts, no foreign fingerprints. Every circuit soldered by a Burkina hand. Every line of code written in a local tongue. It was one of 25 drones in the sky tonight. Some scouting ahead, some watching escape routes, a few already locked on specific targets. But V-17 had only one assignment: watch the girl. Mariama's tiny signal had triggered more than just a location update. It activated the chain. The drones synced silently, adjusting altitude and formation like a school of steel birds. And hundreds of kilometers away, in the heart of a sunken command center buried beneath dry clay and reinforced steel, Captain Ibrahim Traoré opened his eyes. The room was dim. No bright screens, no blinking lights like in Western war movies. Just rows of quiet, focused faces. Soldiers, volunteers, engineers, all watching, listening, breathing as one. The air smelled of metal, sweat, and quiet defiance. Traoré stood at the center, not at a podium, not behind a desk, but shoulder to shoulder with the others. No stars on his shoulder, just a dusty brown shirt and hands clasped behind his back. His eyes, though, were sharp, alive, reading every movement on the wall-sized projection in front of him. The convoy, the routes, the timing, and the margin of error. 32 vehicles, said a voice from behind a monitor. 3 heavy gunners, at least 4 RPGs. Confirm Bashir at center. Traoré didn't respond immediately. He studied the patterns, the angle of the moon, the shifting temperature. Then finally he said only 2 words. They're late. A small wave of tension rippled through the room. Late wasn't good. Late could mean hesitation. Late could mean bait. But no one questioned him. Not because of fear, but because in the 6 months since the coup, he had never missed. There were no foreign generals here. No NATO officers sipping coffee in air-conditioned trailers. No advisors from old colonial regimes. Every person in that room had buried someone, had lost a village, a limb, a future, and that was their credential. Traoré turned to a young engineer, no older than 19, wearing broken glasses and a shirt 3 sizes too big. Give me a thermal overlay on Sector 9, he said. The boy nodded, tapping in a sequence faster than any Western analyst would expect. In seconds, the map lit up, a warm smear of orange where the lead convoy was crawling into a known choke point. Sniper teams in position? Traoré asked. Cobra units ready. VDP volunteers at the riverbed. All silent, came the reply. There was a pause, the kind that stretches time like rubber. Then the captain exhaled slowly. Let them get comfortable. And just like that, you could feel the shift, not in sound, not in movement, but in atmosphere, like the calm before lightning hits the sand. The drone feed showed Bashir lighting another cigarette. His convoy slowed, relaxed. Some fighters were now joking. One man even dozed off, leaning against his rifle. Traoré watched, unblinking. He wasn't waiting for orders. He was the order. And in that silence, beneath the earth, in a command room powered by nothing but battered generators and burning belief, the future of Burkina Faso held its breath. Because this was not just about stopping a convoy. This was about something far greater. This was about showing the world that Africa didn't need permission to defend its own. Traoré's breath was barely audible. He leaned forward just enough for those behind him to see the subtle dip of his chin. A gesture so slight it might have been a twitch of fatigue. Yet everyone in the room recognized it at once. A single nod, no code words, no radio burst. Just a silent permission powerful enough to bend the night. Above the corridor, Drone Phi-17 responded first. Its tiny navigation LEDs blinked twice, then vanished, plunging the craft into perfect darkness. One by one, the other drones followed suit until the convoy crawled beneath a sky that looked unchanged but was suddenly blind to itself. The fighters below kept laughing, oblivious to the small machines now circling like patient hawks made of shadow. Inside the command center, a red outline swept across the wall map. Every target vehicle highlighted, every kill zone confirmed. A soft chime indicated the snipers had locked their optics. Another meant the underground demolition team had armed the remote charges lining the dirt shoulder. Traoré raised a finger, paused on the edge of release, and let the silence stretch exactly 8 seconds. Enough time for Bashir's convoy to drift past the final escape path. Enough time for the universe to hold its breath. Then the captain whispered, "Now!" V-17 dropped 30 feet, steadied, and pulsed a pinpoint laser onto the hood of the lead pickup, the invisible flare that told every Burkina trigger what to do next. In the same heartbeat, 2 miles to the east, a hidden mortar battery coughed once. The first shell arced high, silent in ascent, screaming only in its last 2 seconds, until it punched a clean white flash through the windshield of Bashir's command truck. Metal clanged against metal. Diesel sprayed. The convoy lurched, horns blaring in terrified confusion. At that exact moment, a second drone swooped over the rear vehicle, released a shaped charge, and severed the convoy's tail like a butcher's stroke. Somewhere in the middle, tires screeched, doors flew open, men shouted orders that drowned in their own echo. But the desert around them remained eerily calm. Nothing answered back except the mechanical sigh of drones shifting altitude for a better angle, as if they were adjusting chairs at the theater they themselves had staged. Back underground, Traoré didn't cheer. He simply watched the feed as flames licked higher and tracer rounds sketched frantic red lines across the dark. His people were moving now, Cobra teams sweeping in from the north flank, VDP units crawling up from the riverbed, each step synced to coordinates that had been rehearsed 100 times on chalkboards and bare dirt. It was working perfectly, and yet the captain's expression held no triumph, only a deep, almost sorrowful focus. Because he knew this precision hadn't appeared overnight. It was forged from failures, coups, and forgotten graves, from mothers who whispered secrets and boys who rewired junk into weapons. The convoy's destruction was merely a single night's headline. The real story lay beneath it like bedrock. And that leads to the question, one the world is only beginning to ask. But how did we get here? 1 year before the night the sky turned silent, Burkina Faso was bleeding quietly across its northern provinces. Village by village, the country unraveled, not with explosions, but with silence. It began with whispers, a patrol that never returned, a market that vanished overnight, a school teacher abducted in front of her class. Then came the fire, grain silos torched, wells poisoned, entire districts reduced to ash and memory. Foreign news agencies glanced at the headlines, called it instability, and moved on. Aid organizations issued reports, stamped with logos and urgency, but the money rarely reached the soil. Instead, it dried up in lobbies, lost in handshakes and the polite paralysis of foreign diplomacy. Soldiers on the ground waited weeks for fuel, longer for bullets, and sometimes were paid in sacks of rice instead of money. The insurgents, meanwhile, needed no permission. They crossed borders like ghosts, recruited from the ruins, and spread through Burkina Faso's seams like wildfire. In the capital, government officials spoke of strategic partnerships and security summits, their words heavy with foreign accents. They sat in glass towers funded by aid that never saw a village, and they posed for photos with men in press suits who'd never once stood on Sahel soil. They spoke of counterterrorism like it was a spreadsheet, never mind that children were disappearing from roads that no longer had names. And during all of this, Ibrahim Traoré was still just a captain. Stationed at a rural base that was more sand than structure, he watched his unit shrink with each passing month. Not because of battles, but because his men deserted. Some gave up, others disappeared into the night. Others still were found stripped of their boots and their pride along abandoned roads. What supplies they had came from local villagers. Radios barely worked. Trucks died more often than they started. And yet, orders still came from the capital like clockwork. hold this line, patrol that sector, wait for support. Support never came. Traoré stopped waiting. He was not yet the man who would command drones in silence, nor the symbol that old generals would fear. But even then, something in him had already cracked, not out of rage, but clarity. He saw what others refused to admit, that the system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, to delay, to depend, to defer action until permission was granted. From Paris, from Washington, from anyone but the people bleeding. He began to challenge reports from higher-ups, question the logic of missions that risked lives for meaningless checkpoints. He refused to send patrols without intel from villagers, even if that intel came from barefoot shepherds and not satellite images. Superiors called him undisciplined, reckless. One even labeled him unfit for multinational command. He wore that insult like a badge. In the eyes of many, Traoré was already a problem. In the eyes of his soldiers, he was the only reason they hadn't died. One evening, after attending the funeral of 2 VDP volunteers killed in an ambush the army had known about but ignored, Traoré stood before a makeshift map etched in the dirt and said to his remaining team, "We stop asking. No one's coming. From now on, we act with what we have, our eyes, our ground, and our dead." That night, they began what would later be known as the local doctrine. No satellite feed, no international funding, just notebooks, whispered warnings, and a growing network of people who had lost too much to wait for help. But it wouldn't be enough. Not yet. Not while the cities still clung to the illusion of control. Not while the West still whispered promises into microphones and called them plans. The collapse wasn't an explosion. It was a slow suffocation. A system designed for dependency choking on its own inaction. But in the dust and failure of that system, something else began to form. Something small, stubborn, and fiercely Burkinabe. A captain with no medals, a doctrine with no funding, and a question no one dared say aloud. What if we stopped asking for permission? Before the war reached her village, Zaina was just a teacher. Her classroom had no walls, just wooden benches under a mango tree and a chalkboard propped against a termite mound. The children came barefoot, carrying empty notebooks and eyes too old for their age. She taught them to read, to dream, to count higher than the number of goats their families owned. It wasn't much, but it was hers. A small world of rhythm and laughter in a country where hope had to be grown by hand. Then the trucks came. They didn't arrive with sirens or warnings, just engines and dust, men with guns, faces covered, flags no one had seen before. In minutes, the school became a staging post. The tree was cut down for firewood. The benches were stolen. The chalkboard was burned. Zaina's husband was dragged into the square and shot without a word. Her son, just 7, disappeared. She searched for 3 weeks, walking through the ash of neighboring villages, asking anyone who didn't point a gun at her. But in a land where grief was now common currency, no one had time for her sorrow. Something inside her broke, or maybe something sharpened. She returned to her village alone, stood in the ruins of her classroom, and told the women there, those who hadn't fled, those who hadn't yet buried their own, that waiting had cost them everything. "If we're going to die," she said quietly, "let it be with our eyes open." Zaina did not carry a gun. She didn't give speeches. But over the weeks that followed, she built something far more dangerous than a battalion. She built a network. It began with whispers, literal ones. A woman grinding millet overheard 2 strangers speaking in a dialect that didn't belong. She passed the detail to Zaina while handing her a bundle of firewood. A boy noticed new tire tracks near a dry well. He drew them in the dirt for his grandmother, who repeated them during evening prayers. Every story, every movement, every gut feeling, Zaina collected them like raindrops in a desert. She trained the women to see without staring, to listen without reacting, to remember everything. Who was new in town? Who left food untouched? Who spoke too softly, too formally, or with military posture disguised as fatigue? It wasn't espionage. It was survival. She taught the children to count motorcycles, to listen for gears, to know the difference between a cargo truck and a weapons convoy just by its rhythm on the road. Their notebooks, once filled with letters and numbers, now became ledgers of shadows. How many passed? What direction? How fast? But most importantly, she gave them tools to speak. Radios disguised in clay pots. Flash signals with broken mirrors. Songs sung in code. Zina reprogrammed lullabies into warning systems. A mother humming the wrong tune meant danger on the northern ridge. A skip verse meant a checkpoint ahead. Buried beneath the grief of widows and the silence of orphans was a living map of human sensors, invisible to satellites, yet more accurate than any drone. When the first transmission reached Traoré's outpost, a scrap of fabric with 3 symbols stitched in red, his men dismissed it. But the next day, their patrol found 3 tire burns in the exact place the cloth had warned. 2 weeks later, an ambush was avoided by a 3-note whistle in the wind. Traoré ordered a courier to meet whoever had sent the signal. They brought back a hand-drawn grid, 3 names and 1 sentence written in perfect French. "We are not blind. We are waiting." He smiled for the first time in months. He understood. This was no longer a nation waiting for rescue. This was a people choosing resistance in the only way left to them, with memory, with silence, and with whispers. From that moment on, Traoré's maps included no borders, only names. Zina's network became the veins of a new kind of war, one the world couldn't see, one that didn't march or shout, but moved quietly beneath the surface, gathering force. They called it the Whisper War, and it had just begun. The deeper the resistance grew, the more it thrived on trust. Not the kind found in ranks or ribbons, but something more fragile. Trust built from scraps, glances, unspoken oaths between people who had already lost too much to lose each other. And in war, trust is a currency more valuable than bullets, which is why betrayal doesn't just cost lives. It tears at the very blueprint of what you're trying to build. Captain Traoré knew this. At that time, his network had only begun to bloom. Zina's whispers were threading through towns like wind in tall grass. Civilian volunteers passed coded notes beneath baskets of cassava. Drones, still experimental and clumsy, hovered in training zones. The map on Traoré's office wall, hand-drawn, faded and covered in color-coded markers, was finally beginning to make sense. Patterns were forming, routes were repeating, a new language of enemy movement was taking shape, and with it, an opportunity. But then the silence broke, not from outside, from within. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Nambere, a seasoned officer, twice decorated by former regimes, respected in the capital and known in military circles as the Wall, unshakable, disciplined, always by the book. He had been assigned to observe and advise the northern operations, a vague mandate from what was left of the Central Command. On the surface, he complied with the new doctrine, sat in meetings, listened to reports, nodded where expected. But something never sat right with Traoré. His questions were too broad, too rehearsed. He never asked about civilians, only supply lines and drone models. Then one night, during a routine drone check, a tech unit discovered a frequency leak. Not loud, not obvious, just a faint, repeating signal, piggybacking on the drone telemetry feed. Harmless at first glance, until they traced the receiver. It led to a second satellite dish hidden beneath a camouflage net behind Nembere's quarters. The dish wasn't registered to the Burkina military. It wasn't registered at all. He denied everything, of course. Claimed it was a backup channel, a relic from old communication systems. But when Traoré's men decrypted the data stream, they found something chilling. Coordinates, drone flight paths, whisper reports, even Zina's sector locations, all compiled neatly and sent out to an unidentified third party. No flag, no name, just a signal bouncing through encrypted relays far beyond Burkina Faso. When Traoré confronted him, the man didn't blink. "You don't understand how this works," Nembere said flatly. "We cannot fight alone. We need friends. We need influence. You think your little maps and your barefoot informants will win this war? You'll burn out before you break them." Traoré didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He only asked one question. "Who are you fighting for?" There was no answer. Later that night, in a closed tent lit only by oil lamps, Traoré sat alone. He stared at his own hands, then at the dirt floor, then at the confiscated sat dish. Useless now. silent like the man who once used it. He thought of Zaina, of her whispers, her dead husband, of the children drawing tire tracks in notebooks, of the maps made not with satellites, but with grief. He whispered to himself, so soft even he barely heard it. Can we fight them without becoming like them? It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was a warning. By morning, Nembere was gone, discharged, disgraced, removed without trial. No one spoke of it again. But something changed in the room after that. The glances were sharper, the voices quieter. Because even when you're right, a betrayal like that doesn't leave you. It haunts the way you trust. Still, the work continued, and on the edge of one of Zaina's latest reports, folded into a slip of cloth stitched by a widow's hand, was the first clear hint of something bigger, a crude map drawn in charcoal, marking a path through Arbinda. 30 symbols in a crooked line, most likely vehicles, moving in formation. It wasn't confirmed yet. It wasn't even verified. But as Traoré held it in the light, he felt it in his bones. The convoy was coming. The first time Amadou saw a drone, it wasn't flying. It was broken, half buried in the sand outside a shuttered refugee clinic, its plastic frame cracked, one rotor blade missing, and the lens covered in a paste of dried mud and blood. He was 11, thin, barefoot, arms too long for his body. At that time, he didn't know what it was. He just knew it didn't belong to anyone anymore. And that meant, by the rules of the camp, it was his. He carried it back like treasure, tucking it under his shirt as if afraid the wind might snatch it from him. His tent, if you could call it that, was a sagging triangle of tarp and scavenged wood, wedged between two latrine stations at the edge of Sector 9. He laid the broken drone on a blanket that once belonged to his mother, then stared at it for hours. Not with awe, with curiosity. Why would someone build something that could fly, and then let it fall? Amadou had always been the quiet one, even before the war. His father called him Old Eyes. His mother said he dreamed in numbers. That was before they were both lost in the fire that erased his village in minutes, before he became a number in a report no one read. But if the world had forgotten his name, he had not forgotten how to learn. There was a school tent in the camp, only open when the UN volunteers remembered to unlock it. But Amadou never waited for lessons. He found a cracked tablet left behind by an aid worker. No power cord, no internet, just a half-functioning battery and a browser frozen on a cached article. Building your first DIY quadcopter. It became his gospel. At night, when other boys played football with balls made of trash bags, Amadou sifted through e-waste behind the abandoned field clinic. Broken radios, discarded chargers, phones without screens. He cleaned the circuits with toothpaste and river water, heated copper with a candle, used a toothbrush for a soldering tool. Every wire he twisted was an act of resurrection, breathing life back into things the world had thrown away, just like it had thrown away him. He didn't call it building. He called it listening. Listening to the broken pieces, to what they remembered, what they still wanted to become. It took 6 months. 6 months of cuts and burns, of failure after failure, of nights sleeping next to what looked more like a dying insect than a machine. But one morning, just after the rain season's final storm, Amadou placed his Frankenstein drone on a slab of concrete, stepped back, and pressed a button wired into an old SIM card slot. It lifted, only a meter off the ground. Wobbly, whirring, almost falling, but flying. The entire camp heard the noise. Some ducked, others stared. One old woman screamed, thinking it was the devil. But Amadou stood still, eyes wide, mouth closed, watching his invention hover in place like a miracle too afraid to believe in itself. That night, someone from the local VDP cell came looking for him. Word had spread. The boy who made the air move. They didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't trained. But he had made a machine with his bare hands. And in a war where information meant survival, that was enough. Within weeks, Amadou was relocated to a hidden workshop near Kaya, one of the first drone labs being pieced together under Traoré's command. There were no white coats, no lab safety, just broken fans, stripped batteries, scattered schematics taped to the walls. It felt like home. There, he met other boys and girls like him, orphans, refugees, former students turned engineers out of necessity. Together, they didn't just fix drones, they redesigned them. Lighter frames, longer range, better optics. Amadou became their North Star, not because he talked, but because he understood something the rest were only beginning to learn. When you've lost everything, even flight becomes possible. His first drone, the broken one he'd found and rebuilt, was mounted on the wall with a name scrawled beneath it in charcoal. Hope 1. It never flew again. But what it inspired, what it ignited, was already in the sky. There was no formal recruitment process, no posters, no enlistment centers with brass bands or patriotic slogans. Instead, Captain Traoré's search for engineers began where most commanders wouldn't dare to look. In the markets, the ruins, the forgotten corners of a country most had already given up on. He walked through flea markets in Kaya, combed through junk stalls in Kongusi, and stopped at every roadside electronics shack between Wahiguya and the capital. Not to find equipment, to find minds. Teenagers repairing old radios with bottle caps and copper wire. Girls modifying broken phones with plastic spoons and battery cells. Young men building amplifiers from motorcycle parts. Broadcasting pirate FM signals across refugee camps. They had no degrees, no resumes, but they all had one thing in common. They had figured out how to make something out of nothing. When Traoré spoke to them, he didn't ask for loyalty. He asked a single question. What would you build if no one stopped you? And every time, their eyes lit up. Some were school dropouts, forced out by war. Others had once studied engineering before universities collapsed. A few had been street vendors, coding software on stolen smartphones to survive. All of them had stories written not in ink, but in burn marks, soldering scars, and sleepless nights. He gathered them in what used to be an abandoned vocational school, its roof half gone, blackboards crumbling, windows broken, but the walls still standing. They cleaned it together, rewired the place, replaced desks with workbenches. Every corner was repurposed. Storage closets became labs, mop rooms turned into microchip clean zones. They called it the nest. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. From the nest, the real work began. They didn't have blueprints. They didn't have 3D printers or cleanroom vacuums. What they had were fragments, salvaged plastics, broken RC toys, abandoned drone husks from international crash sites, smuggled GoPro lenses, and hours of pirated tutorials saved offline. But under Traoré's direction, with Amadou now among them, they started building the unthinkable, a sovereign drone fleet, built in the shadows, for a war that had no rules. The first models were crude but functional. Surveillance units, fitted with thermal lenses from trashed medical gear. High-altitude scouts, built with carbon rods from broken bicycle frames. Then came the innovations. Miniature whispers, palm-sized drones with no GPS, silent rotors, capable of hovering at treetop height for hours, beaming video back in real time. Next were the strikers, fast, brutal, and precise, designed not to cause mass destruction, but surgical elimination. Each drone was tagged not with serial numbers, but with names. Names of villages burned, names of people lost, names that had been erased from the headlines. One drone bore the name Traoré, after a town wiped out in a single morning. Another was simply called Maman. Traoré gave no lectures. He didn't need to. His presence alone reminded them this wasn't science fiction. It was survival. Every test flight wasn't just a trial. It was a message. We don't wait for Paris. We don't beg Washington. We fly. Soon the nest became more than a lab. It became a doctrine, a living belief that war didn't belong solely to the powerful anymore. That knowledge could be weaponized, decentralized, and directed by those who once had nothing but pain. Each successful flight was proof that Burkina Faso didn't need permission, only purpose. And with every line of code written, with every salvaged rotor lifted into the sky, the nest gave birth to something far more dangerous than a drone. It gave birth to a system of resistance, a doctrine carved not in paper, but in plastic, solder, and loss. And for the first time in years, the balance of fear in the Sahel began to shift. Not with tanks, not with treaties, but with wings. They built the command center in the most improbable place, beneath an abandoned grain silo on the outskirts of the capital, where vermin once nested in empty harvest bins. Engineers from the nest excavated at night, poured cement in silence, and wired the chambers with scavenged fiber pulled from decommissioned telecom lines. By dawn, the silo looked deserted, rusted as always. Underground, however, a warren of low-ceiling rooms glowed with screens stitched together from broken televisions and surplus laptop panels. Here data pooled like groundwater, live drone feeds, village radio whispers, hand-drawn maps scanned by candlelight. Electricity came from 4 diesel generators disguised as farm machinery above. They called the facility the Burrow, a place no spy satellite would bother to notice and no foreign advisor had ever been invited to see. Inside, rank blurred. Uniformed soldiers sat beside barefoot volunteers. A former market vendor parsed sensor telemetry next to a captain who once commanded tanks. The integration was messy by design. VDP militiamen, farmers who had traded hoes for rifles, shared frontline observations through battered walkie-talkies. Village elders phoned barrel-mounted cell towers after sunset, reporting unfamiliar footpaths weaving through millet fields. Regular infantry squads fed coordinates from antiquated GPS receivers. Every scrap of information flowed into a single operating grid projected across 3 walls, updated in real time by Amadou's custom software. Bright icons moved, merged, vanished. Enemy convoys, livestock herds, patrol units, each tagged and color-coded, so anyone, literate or not, could read the battle at a glance. It was, as Traoré liked to say, a people's war with digital eyes. Command decisions unfolded in murmurs rather than orders. A grandmother's late-night call about engine noises might reroute a reconnaissance drone within minutes. A child's count of new motorcycles in the weekly market could trigger an alert across the entire northern sector. When a threat crystallized, the strike protocol began, not with a launch code, but with a question projected in red on the main screen. Have we cleared the road? Only after confirmation from at least 2 independent human eyes, often Zaina's network of mothers, sometimes VDP scouts perched in baobab trees, did the display shift to green. Then a single keystroke from the Burrow guided a drone to its target, hardly louder than the rustle of a kite. Traoré enshrined this safeguard in a statement painted above the doorway to the drone bay in both French and Moray. No drone will strike unless a mother confirms the road is empty. It was more than rule, it was covenant. Villagers who had once feared anything that buzzed overhead now felt ownership. Each flight, each mission carried their consent. And because the promise was kept, because children were never caught in the crossfire, the flow of grassroots intelligence only grew richer, denser, unstoppable. Within months, the Burrow could choreograph simultaneous operations across 3 provinces, guiding handmade aircraft through corridors of wind and darkness while Cobra commandos advanced on foot. International analysts, baffled by the sudden precision, searched the sky for foreign fingerprints and found none. What they failed to see was hidden underground, an army held together by patch wires, borrowed faith, and the simple, radical idea that security begins with the voices of those who have the most to lose. Patterns always whisper before they scream, and the Burrow was trained to hear the first rustle. 3 weeks after the new command grid went live, stray reports began to cluster on its glowing map. A pair of dusty land cruisers spotted near Tatao, a string of motorbikes fueling at a dry riverbed outside Pensa, a flatbed truck hauling what looked like sheets of tin, but weighed too much for metal alone. Nothing seemed urgent by itself, yet each icon pulsed the same blood-red tone that Amadou's software used for plausible danger. Traoré watched the dots migrate south every night, as though an invisible hand were sliding game pieces across the Sahel. The first solid clue arrived from a place no satellite would have searched, a goat market in the hamlet of Garmi. A 12-year-old boy named Issouf, paid only with a bowl of rice and the promise of new sandals, crouched behind grain sacks and counted axles as vehicles rolled through the dusty square. He recorded the numbers on the inside of his forearm with charcoal. When he reached 20 axles, he scratched a deeper mark, then slipped away to whisper the tally to Auntie Salou, who wasn't his aunt at all but a former midwife now serving as the sector's relay. Before dusk, her coded lullaby drifted through a broken shortwave set, and the burrow's wall lit up. 8 trucks heading west, heavy suspension. The next day, an elder near Jibo heard engines where there should have been cicadas. His grandson held a cracked phone skyward until it caught a single bar, just long enough for the old man's voice to rumble. "Different noise tonight. Big cylinders, not bikes." The call dropped, but the grid shifted again. 2 points began to align, then 3, then 5, sketching a slow arc toward the Arbinda corridor. That line, thin, tentative, was enough for Zaina to call an emergency circle of whisperers. Women shelling peanuts memorized license plate fragments. Shepherds traced tread depth in the dust with knuckles. Each fragment, fed into the burrow, sharpened the convoy's outline like charcoal on rough paper. Yet certainty in war is a moving target. 4 nights later, the line vanished. Radios went dead across 3 villages. The grid showed nothing but static until sunrise revealed the reason. Kuruma had burned. Huts collapsed into coals. Livestock shot in their pens. They found the teacher who once sang code songs for Zaina's network face down in the well. The convoy's shadow had passed through, taking food, fuel, and every phone it could find, scrubbing the land of eyes before melting back into the thorn, as if daring the new doctrine to keep up. The loss pierced the burrow like shrapnel. For the first time, Zaina's calm cracked. Her voice trembled as she listed the missing names. Traoré answered by doubling the watch. Children posted on termite mounds with tin mirrors. Grandmothers shifted from kitchens to hilltops with wind-up radios. At night, VDP patrols rode bicycles instead of motorbikes, coasting downhill with engines off so they could listen for an unfamiliar clutch or the cough of an untuned diesel. Even the drones altered their cadence, hovering higher in daylight to avoid discovery, then swooping low after moonset to scan tire heat on the sand. 16 hours after Kuruma fell silent, a new report surfaced from an unlikely survivor, a blind griot who felt vibrations through the ground while sitting outside his hut near Gaskinde. He testified that an iron river with many hearts rolled past before dawn. The griot had once tuned drums by resonance. He could tell the difference between a truck and a tank by the way earth shivered beneath his palms. According to him, the iron river was at least a kilometer long and moved like a single beast. His account, run through Amadou's pattern filter, aligned perfectly with earlier sightings. The convoy not only existed, it was larger than anyone feared, perhaps 30 vehicles, maybe more, and accelerating. That same evening, an intelligence team stationed near the Wango Ford failed to check in. They were 3 volunteers and a drone pilot named Sita, last seen launching a micro-unit to monitor dust plumes on the horizon. Their silence was louder than any explosion. Zaina wrote their names on the map in blue chalk, circled them twice, then pressed her finger to the center until the pigment smeared. No one asked why. Traoré stood before the grid, expressionless, while data flickered like restless fireflies. The pattern had stopped whispering. It was beginning to roar. A red arc now curved unmistakably toward Arbinda, midpoint of 3 provinces, lifeline to 500,000 civilians. If the convoy reached that corridor unchallenged, it could splinter in any direction, torching villages faster than warnings could travel. The captain tapped the screen once. All chatter in the burrow ceased. "The beast is moving," he said quietly. "We move faster." Outside, under an ink-black sky, the first strike teams tightened their boots. Above them, drones lifted into night air, so still they seemed part of the stars. Digital eyes searching for a predator, too confident to notice it was already being hunted. The drones began flying in shifts, quiet, tireless, and cold. Their wings never flapped, their eyes never blinked, and their operators, hidden in bunkers or leaning over flickering screens deep in village basements, never truly slept. Traoré's doctrine didn't require dominance of the air. It demanded something more elusive, constant presence, not to strike, not yet, but to watch, to haunt, to become something that insurgents could never predict but always feel. The drones flew high at first, circling from dusk till dawn like silent vultures tracking a dying beast. Then they dropped lower with each pass, shifting altitude at irregular intervals to mask their rhythm. They weren't built for beauty. They hummed. They shook. Their cameras sometimes glitched in heat waves or picked up reflections off sand. But they endured. Some, like the micro models, were small enough to hide behind acacia branches or drift with the wind as if lost. Others flew higher than birds, mimicking weather balloons and mirroring clouds. From above, the convoy looked like ants dragging thorns across the desert. Uneven, strangely synchronized, too large to be random. Drone 7 Delta tracked the lead trucks for 72 straight hours, relaying footage back to the burrow every 10 minutes. Amadou watched it from a dim back room filled with humming fans and the soft click of keys. His software logged every stop, each refueling point, and the duration of each break. The data began to reveal a tempo, a heartbeat. The convoy moved with intent, never retreating, always converging. But where and when? Then at 3:42 a.m. on the fourth night, everything nearly fell apart. Drone 9 Kilo, a newer prototype still in field testing, was shadowing the middle portion of the convoy at low altitude, roughly 50 meters, hovering just behind a cluster of flatbeds. Its camera was panning right when a glint from its frame, no larger than a fingernail, caught the eye of a militant urinating behind his truck. He squinted upward. The drone froze mid-hover. The man reached for his rifle. In the burrow, an operator's hand jerked instinctively toward the abort command, but Amadou shouted, "No! Hover into cloud drift!" The operator hesitated, then guided the drone diagonally into a patch of low fog where morning dew had yet to burn off. For 5 long seconds, the man stared. The drone hovered just behind the mist. Sensors dimmed, rotors slowed. Then the man shook his head, zipped up, and walked away. The room exhaled as one. The feed resumed. The game continued. It was a close call and a warning. The convoy was growing cautious. Zaina, meanwhile, had been poring over intercepted audio relays from her network of whisperers. Her wall of notes now stretched across 3 tarps sewn together with fishing wire, symbols, times, approximated routes. She used colored thread to map messages like neurons connecting a brain. One pattern repeated too often to ignore. Movements towards Sebera, Cumbri, and Lelou. 3 villages in different provinces, all traditionally cooperative, all tied to water access routes. It wasn't random. It was a wedge formation, a 3-pronged strike meant to splinter the northern corridor and confuse defenders. If each village fell in rapid succession, it would force military units to fragment across too many fronts, breaking the spine of local coordination. Zaina marked the 3 points, drew a triangle between them, and stared. "This isn't a raid," she whispered. "It's a feint and a burn." She called the burrow within the hour. When the call came through, Traoré stepped away from the drone feeds. Zaina didn't wait for greetings. "They'll strike in 2 days," she said. "Simultaneous. 3 points. If we divide our response, they'll win. If we don't respond, they'll torch everything." Traoré was silent for a moment. Then, "And if we lure them into thinking we've already divided?" Zaina paused. "Then we need more ghosts in the sky." That night, 10 new drones launched from 5 hidden locations, spreading out like invisible sentinels across the Sahel. They would not fire, not yet. Their only mission was to watch, to listen, and to make the enemy believe no one was watching. But the truth was simple. Burkina Faso was watching, closer than ever. The desert held its breath. The horizon, once empty, now pulsed with the distant shimmer of heat mirages and fine dust clouds that whispered of incoming steel. But no one moved. Not yet. Because every inch of ground between the Arbinda corridor and the convoy's last known position had already been transformed, not into a battlefield, but into a trap. Snipers arrived first. Carried in by night under canvas tarps, they were dropped off in pairs, moving silently through thorny brush and ravines carved by seasons long gone. Their rifles were outdated, many of them refurbished from decades-old colonial models, but their aim was steady, precise. They dug shallow cradles beneath bushes and rock outcroppings, cloaked themselves in handmade ghillie suits stitched with dry grass and strips of rags soaked in dust. Each had one target memorized: a face, a uniform, a gait. Some would later say they could smell the convoy before they saw it. Drones hovered high above, motionless against the evening sky. Some carried nothing but wide-lens cameras. Others were now equipped with a makeshift laser designation system, a narrow beam of blue light, invisible in daylight but sharp at dusk, capable of painting targets on the ground that would be visible only to helmet visors of ground teams below. They didn't fire missiles. They didn't need to. Their job was simple: mark the moment. Below the snipers and drones, the people dug. Farmers who had once carved trenches for irrigation now hollowed the earth for war. VDP units, some barely past their teens, others with gray in their beards, worked by hand to shape the terrain. They dug funnel paths between thorn walls. They buried tripwires beneath sand disguised with goat prints. Every potential escape route was studied and calculated, not by engineers, but by shepherds who knew the land better than any satellite. Pitfalls were camouflaged with palm leaves. Traps were triggered by cans, string, and instinct. Still, no one moved. The convoy was closing in. Intercepted radio chatter confirmed its size. 34 vehicles, possibly more. Bashir's voice had returned, barking orders, confident and sharp. The formation was holding steady. The drones watched him step from vehicle to vehicle, like a man taking inventory of his victory. In the burrow, Amadou sat before 5 screens, each flashing a portion of the corridor. Data streamed in from all corners: sniper coordinates, dust density, engine temperature, wind speed. Everything was aligned. Everything was ready. All that remained was the most elusive piece of any perfect ambush: timing. Zaina sat with a map stretched across her lap, tracing lines with her finger, whispering probabilities. She had already placed markers at the exit routes, assigned codes to every local informant still within whispering distance. Her message had gone out to mothers, farmers, even children. Hold your signal. Not yet, only when the night turns. In the center of the command room, Traoré stood silent. His eyes were on the feed, live video from above. Glowing white figures crossing a red line they didn't know had been drawn. His hand hovered above the approval switch, the single action that would turn stillness into thunder. Someone behind him asked, barely above a whisper, "Sir, is it time?" Traoré didn't turn around. His voice was low but steady, sharp as a blade held to a breath. "Not when they arrive," he said. "When they believe they've won." And so the army of farmers, orphans, and whisperers waited. The drones hovered. The snipers steadied their fingers. The traps remained hidden beneath the dust. And the enemy, full of confidence, roaring through the golden corridor of Arbinda, had no idea they weren't entering a village. They were entering history. Midnight settled like ash over the Arbinda corridor, thick and silent, the kind of darkness that convinced even the moon to keep its distance. 34 trucks rolled in 2 ragged columns, engines idling low to save fuel, headlights blacked out to keep the desert blind. Bashir rode near the middle, boots propped on a crate of mortar shells, cigarette ember flickering with each drag. He didn't know the convoy had already crossed an invisible threshold, past the last safe bend, beyond every escape track. Overhead, 2 drones drifted at different altitudes, motors trimmed to a whisper beneath the wind's soft breath. The lead flatbed hit the kill zone at 0008. Its driver never saw the thin beam of blue light that danced across the hood, nor the tiny disc that followed, no bigger than a tin can, released from drone 517. The disc struck the windshield, adhered for a heartbeat, and exploded. A white flash split the night, followed by a bloom of crimson fire that punched upward and outward, peeling metal like wet bark. The blast cracked windows 3 trucks back and sent a shockwave racing down the sand. For a moment, the desert was bright as noon. Then it was darker than before, filled only with smoke, sparks, and the ringing echo of something irretrievably wrong. The convoy slammed to a halt. Brakes screeched, doors flew open, men tumbled into the dust grasping rifles and yelling orders, drowned by their own panic. Bashir's cigarette fell from his lips. He barked at the radio operator, but the radio crackled with nothing. Jammers hidden in thorn scrub had smothered every frequency the moment the disc detonated. One of his lieutenants fired blindly at the sky, tracer rounds stitching red slashes that hit nothing but stars. Confusion spread faster than flame. Drivers tried to reverse, but the narrower rear column blocked them in, wheels spinning, bumpers colliding. Some leapt from cabs and sprinted into the dark, only to stumble upon wires strung ankle-high between rocks, triggering flares that burst overhead and turned the night into a strobing nightmare of silhouettes. Bashir shoved men aside, clawed to the roof of his vehicle, and peered west, searching for anything. An enemy line, a muzzle flash, a sign of where to point his fury. Instead, he heard a low humming crescendo, different from the first drone, deeper, heavier, like a distant hive moving as one. He turned just in time to see drone K3 dive out of the black, nose angled at the convoy's tail. K3 carried a shape-charged cylinder packed with fertilizer compound and scrap steel bearings. At 40 meters, it released the charge. Gravity and guidance did the rest. The cylinder hit the last transport, an armored ammunition carrier, right on the axle. The detonation lifted the truck clear off its wheels, spraying molten fragments that ripped through the vehicles parked behind it. Diesel geysered, igniting in midair. A firewall shot across the roadway, sealing the column's rear like a molten gate. What had been a supply caravan was now a cage. Men tried to regroup, shouting for RPGs, heavy guns, any target to shoot, but the drones stayed invisible, sliding laterally to new perches. In the flashing firelight, Bashir could see the trap forming, lead truck gone, tail ruptured, both ends aflame. He ordered a breakout to the north shoulder, unaware that hours earlier villagers had dug trenches there. 5-foot pits covered with straw mats dusted in sand. The first fleeing pickup plunged in nose first and stuck. The second veered, hit a buried spike strip, and fishtailed into an acacia tree. Chaos thickened, choking discipline. Above, V-17's camera zoomed, transmitting every movement to the burrow. Traoré watched impassively as icons blinked red. He gave a single nod. Sniper teams answered. From dunes and rock lips ringing the corridor, suppressed rifle cracks popped like knuckles. Leaders dropped first, a gunner reaching for the ZU-23, a radio chief raising his handset, a spotter scanning the ridgeline. Each fell before his body understood it had been chosen. Bashir ducked behind a gearbox, shouting for smoke grenades. None left. He tried the radio again. Static. Tried shouting orders, swallowed by engine roar and men screaming in 3 dialects. He realized then the night had a pulse not his own, and he was hearing it for the first time. Inside the wrecked front truck, flames licked a box of illumination rounds. When they cooked off, brilliant magnesium arcs shot skyward and burst, bathing the kill zone in ghost-white glare. For the first time, Bashir could see the full extent of the ambush, the funneled roadway, the trenches, the dark shapes of snipers cresting ridges like silhouettes cut from the stars. And he understood the terrible symmetry of it. Caught between 2 fires, pinned under unseen wings, his army no longer marching, but drowning in its own smoke. He inhaled scorched air that tasted of metal and regret. And the question that rose in his mind was not how to win, but how anyone had known exactly where he would break. His answer came in the form of a single blue laser dot that danced across his chest, steady, deliberate, merciless, before the night ignited again. From above, the battlefield didn't look like chaos. It looked like choreography. 3 drones moved through the burning air in sweeping arcs, their patterns tight, precise, and hauntingly beautiful. One curved wide, releasing a flash bang near the eastern tree line that sent a cluster of insurgents scrambling in the wrong direction. Another climbed swiftly, hovered, and dropped a thermobaric charge in the dead center of the convoy, scattering fire and pressure in equal measure. The third skimmed just meters above the sand, its rotors stirring up a ghostly swirl of smoke, guiding the enemy exactly where it wanted them to go. Each drone acted like a dancer in a tightly rehearsed performance, dipping, twirling, striking. They weren't just attacking, they were conducting, and every movement had a purpose. Herd the enemy into the funnel, break their lines of communication, isolate the survivors. In the drone bay, deep within the burrow, Amadou sat motionless, fingers gliding over his cracked keyboard. His screen glowed with infrared silhouettes. His eyes never blinked. To the others around him, he looked like a boy. But at that moment, he was the conductor of the sky. He zoomed in on a single tent-shaped structure toward the center of the convoy, a command hub Bashir's men had hastily erected before the ambush. The canvas flapped violently in the firelit wind, but the signal antenna still blinked faintly. Without breaking rhythm, Amadou deployed a micro-drone, no larger than a pigeon. It slipped between metal debris, rose up from beneath a flipped truck, and slid through a torn flap of the tent. Inside, a man shouted into a silent radio. Another fumbled with a sat phone. The drone's tiny camera fed it all back live. Amadou didn't need permission. He tagged 3 figures in red and sent the coordinates to Zina. 20 kilometers away, seated on the floor of an old storage room, repurposed as a field station, Zaina watched the feed on a repurposed tablet. Her face was calm, but her hand gripped a worn prayer bead tight enough to turn her knuckles white. She tapped the screen once, sent the location to a nearby VDP team already on foot, and whispered into her comms, "The nest is open. Strike the heart." And strike they did. The VDP emerged not from one direction, but from everywhere. Crawling from irrigation ditches, rising from behind tree stumps, sprinting across dunes with rifles slung and machetes drawn. They had no uniforms, no polished boots. Many wore mismatched sandals, torn shirts, scarves soaked in sweat and grit, but their eyes burned like fire. Some were no older than 16. Others had gray in their beards. All had lost something. All had waited for this. They moved with purpose. They didn't scream. They didn't shoot wildly. Their training had been fast, but their intent was forged in pain. Some went straight for the trapped vehicles, dragging insurgents out by their collars. Others targeted weapons caches, disarming RPGs and tossing fuel barrels into pits already dug by the farmers who once tilled those fields. The moment the VDP breached the command tent, Amadou's drone lifted gently, pivoted once, and escaped back through the flap. A second later, the tent went up in flames. No orders had been shouted. No foreign advisor had signed off. It had happened the way a brush fire spreads, inevitable, driven by heat and wind and instinct. From her post, Zina watched without blinking. Her screen was cracked, the signal jittery, but she saw enough. The field was turning. The enemy's formation had collapsed. Their center had gone dark. Their noise had turned into screaming. And above it all, 3 drones still danced, not to win a battle, but to finish a symphony long in the making. The insurgents tried to flee. They always did. But the corridor they had charged into so confidently was no longer a road. It was a maze, rigged and narrowing with every breath. Pushed by fire, boxed by bullets, they ran in packs toward what seemed like open ground, only to find themselves funneled into pre-mapped mine belts, buried the week before by villagers who had memorized every foot of terrain. The first explosion took out a pair of bikes, shredding rubber and bone with equal indifference. Then another blast, off to the left, where a squad had split away, hoping to flank the snipers. Dust sprayed skyward. Cries rang out. One man limped away, dragging a mangled leg, only to be pulled behind a rock and silenced by a sniper's whisper. The shots weren't random. They were surgical. Each bullet came from a barrel cooled in wet cloth, each scope dialed in days before. The snipers picked off commanders first, those shouting orders, those reaching for comms, those raising weapons with too much certainty. One by one, the headless body of the convoy stumbled without direction, trapped in its own momentum, its own arrogance. Some fighters dropped their weapons and tried to crawl away through the brush, but infrared drones overhead tracked them like insects moving across a heated plate. They were tagged and marked for capture. Those who continued to fight found themselves cornered not by army regiments or armored columns, but by farmers, men and women who once sold yams and ground millet, now wielding rifles and moving like smoke through the trees. And then, as if the war itself took a breath, one man stood up. He emerged from a crater where a truck had burned, hands raised, shirt torn and soaked in soot. His rifle was gone. His voice cracked as he shouted in broken Moray, "PTA! PTA! Mercy!" He stumbled forward, one eye swollen shut, blood crusted at his temple. One of the VDP volunteers raised her weapon. Another stepped in front of her and waved her down. For a long moment, silence hung, charged and uneasy. The man collapsed to his knees. His body trembled not from fear, but from exhaustion. Then the VDP fighter who had stopped the shot knelt beside him, opened a canteen, and pressed it to his lips. It wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Traoré's orders were clear. Anyone who surrenders lives. The war ends when they lay down arms, not when we silence them all. Captured fighters meant intelligence, maps, codes, patterns, names. But more than that, mercy was power. The kind insurgents didn't expect from those they'd terrorized. By the time the last shots faded, the sun had begun to rise. Smoke curled lazily over the scorched road, casting long shadows across the still warm sand. Crows circled overhead, uncertain whether to land. The ground was littered with metal husks and silence. A silence that was not peace but something heavier, something earned. Zaina stood on a hilltop at the edge of the corridor, a scarf pulled tight over her hair. Her eyes scanned the devastation below. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply stood still, as if daring the wind to carry the truth of what had happened to the rest of the world. No parades, no speeches, just the truth, written in smoke and dust. The ambush was complete. The corridor was theirs, and the war had changed. Forever. There were no fireworks, no songs on the radio, no marching columns through Ouagadougou. The news of the Arbinda ambush didn't arrive with press releases or roaring speeches from a balcony. It came in murmurs, whispers, carried from village to village on crackling phones and breathless messengers. "They're gone," they said. "The convoy was broken." But even those words felt too heavy to speak aloud. Victory had come not with cheers, but with quiet. At dawn, the soldiers didn't raise their fists. They raised shovels. The battlefield still smoked, warm with the ghost of fire. Instead of stepping over the dead, they gathered the bodies, gently, deliberately. There was no cruelty in the cleanup, no gloating, just duty. One VDP fighter whispered a prayer as he lowered a bloodied arm into the earth. Another helped lift a corpse from beneath the axle of a truck, wiping ash from its face. They buried the enemy with the same hands they had once used to bury their neighbors. There was no joy in it, only closure. In the surrounding villages, teams moved swiftly. Doors were repaired, wells unclogged, markets cleared of debris. The same volunteers who had carried rifles now carried lumber. Soldiers who had fought side by side with mothers and teachers now asked where the grain was stored and how many roofs had been lost to wind. It wasn't an order. It was instinct. No one wanted to return to war. They wanted something to hold, something to rebuild. In the burrow, Traoré sat alone in the command chamber. The wall of screens now dark, the hum of engines finally stilled. His fingers traced the edge of a sheet of notebook paper, folded and smudged. It was a gift from Amadou, slipped into his hand before the boy left for his next drone assignment. The drawing was rough, made in pencil, likely stolen from a classroom long abandoned. It showed 3 children holding kites, box-shaped kites with long tails, and above them, a wide open sky. There were no drones, no missiles, just blue and silence, and wind. In the corner, the title read, "A Sky with No War." Traoré stared at it for a long time. Not because it was perfect, but because it was possible. In the days that followed, the quiet was interrupted not by gunfire, but by questions. In markets and under mango trees, from the mouths of elders and youth alike, came the same haunting refrain. Why didn't we do this before? It wasn't just curiosity, it was pain, laced with hindsight. If this kind of defense had been possible, then why had so many died? Why had entire villages been erased while foreign soldiers guarded empty outposts? The realization stung deeper than any wound. Burkina Faso had always had the courage. What it lacked was permission, and now that permission had been thrown away like a broken chain. The world took notice. News agencies, used to portraying Burkina as a victim state in slow collapse, suddenly scrambled to revise their tone. Headlines hesitated between awe and alarm. Phrases like unexpected military sophistication, grassroots-led ambush, and indigenous warfare innovation were tossed around in press rooms. Some admired the efficiency, others grew uneasy, because this wasn't just a victory, it was independence, and not the kind brokered in Western boardrooms. With that independence came suspicion. Rumors began to circulate. Some voices on international media called the operation too clean, Others accused the army of summary executions, violations of human rights, and silencing of survivors. Anonymous posts flooded message boards, questioning whether the VDP were truly volunteers or part of a darker militia movement. Traoré's government denied it calmly, offering footage, testimony, and the names of the 112 insurgents captured alive. But truth now had to compete with narratives, and the louder the victory echoed across Africa, the harder certain powers tried to drown it out. Because for some, a small nation's self-reliance wasn't inspiring. It was dangerous. The rumors might have festered longer, if not for a single video, shaky, grainy, but undeniable. It came from a teenage girl in Sebera, uploaded to a low-bandwidth channel just hours after the smoke had cleared. The footage showed her walking through the ruins of her village, narrating softly and fulfilled. But there were no bodies, no collapsed homes, no civilian graves, only standing houses, recovered food stores, and Burkina volunteers helping rebuild a collapsed wall, smiling wearily in the background. Her final words, barely audible, stopped the scroll of 1,000 feeds. They came to save us, not to fight, but to stay. The video spread fast, first in WhatsApp groups, then on national broadcasts, then across Africa. And soon other governments began to call. From Mali, from Niger, from Congo. Officials, commanders, even youth activists, all asking one thing: how? How did a nation dismissed as fractured, forgotten, pull off the most precise operation in Sahel military history? And more importantly, how could they do the same? When pressed by foreign media at a rare public address, Captain Traoré didn't speak long. He simply stepped forward, held up Amadou's drawing and said, "We did not win a war. We protected a future." Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked into the capital's war-scarred parliament and stunned the chamber. He refused the presidency. Instead, he handed a single page to the clerk, an executive order transferring authority to a broadly elected civilian council drawn from every province, every faith, every scar. With power set aside, he turned to what mattered: capacity. A month later, the doors of the Sahel Rural Tech Institute swung open inside a converted grain depot. Here, solar panels hummed, 3D printed rotor blades spun on test benches, and teenagers soldered by lantern light. Amadou, now 17, taught the first class, Drone Logic 101, his voice shy but steady as he explained how scrap radios could guide a camera over 20 kilometers of desert. Around him, farm kids who had never touched a laptop began coding flight paths that followed goat trails instead of paved roads. The lesson was simple: own the sky, feed the ground, ask no one's permission. On the ruins of her old classroom, Zina rebuilt the school, but this time the blackboard was flanked by antennae. The building doubled as a community intelligence hub: market prices at dawn, rainfall at noon, convoy sightings at dusk. Mothers filed reports between lessons in arithmetic. Grandfathers taught map reading beside grandchildren learning to read. The former VDP, rifles now locked away, re-emerged as civil guardians, patching wells, raising footbridges, escorting medical caravans. Yet as villages stitched themselves back together, whispers lingered. Traders on the Mali border spoke of regrouping warlords. A burned-out pickup discovered near the frontier hinted at scouting parties. Over evening fires, the question returned like a stubborn cough: what if they come again? The answer was never shouted, only implied in the steady glow of the hub's radios and the quiet thrum of night-watch drones circling overhead. It was a quiet night, clear skies, no wind, just the soft hum of crickets and the faint buzz of an old drone gliding overhead. It wasn't armed, no rockets, no sensors for targets, just one simple camera, slowly scanning the village below. In the courtyard of Zaina's school, now glowing with soft, solar-powered light, children sat hunched over wooden desks, tracing letters and numbers on scrap paper. Laughter mixed with concentration, a teacher's voice echoed gently, carried by the still air. The drone hovered for a moment, steady, watching, not as a weapon, but as a witness. In the burrow, now a public archive of the war, Traoré, Zina, Amadou, and a few others watched the live feed in silence. No orders, no tension, just quiet pride. Then the drone blinked once, twice, 3 times. It used to mean target locked. Now it simply meant they're still dreaming. This story is not just about war or victory. It's about what happens when people stop waiting to be saved and start saving themselves. Burkina Faso's transformation, led not by generals in distant capitals, but by farmers, students, mothers, and a boy with a drone, reminds us that strength doesn't always come from power. Sometimes it comes from clarity, purpose, and unity. Captain Traoré's refusal to cling to power, Zaina's rebuilding of a broken school into a center of hope, and Amadou's journey from refugee to teacher, they each show us a different kind of leadership, one that listens before it commands, one that protects without dominating, one that chooses to build rather than conquer. In a world where too often the most vulnerable are treated as passive, this story flips the narrative. It says you don't need permission to fight for your future. And maybe the quiet revolution here isn't just military. It's the courage to dream again, even after everything's been taken. What do you believe matters more in a nation's future? Strong leaders or strong people who no longer feel afraid? Let's talk. Your voice matters. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth. Subscribe now. Your curiosity fuels the next story,